Part 1. The morning light filtered through the towering windows of Thornfield Manor, casting long shadows across the marble floors where Eleanor Fairfax knelt, her hands raw from scrubbing. She had arrived at this palatial estate 3 weeks prior, carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel and the weight of circumstances that had driven her from her former life as a governess to the children of a bankrupt merchant family. The position of housemaid was beneath her education, yet pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Eleanor possessed that peculiar quality which society deemed unremarkable, a plain countenance that invited neither second glances nor whispered conversations. Her brown hair was perpetually pinned in a severe chignon. Her grey eyes reflected a quiet intelligence that went largely unnoticed, and her slender frame moved through the grand corridors with the practiced invisibility of the serving class. She had learned, through years of harsh necessity, that anonymity was often a woman's greatest protection. The master of Thornfield Manor, Damien Blackwood, was a man whose very presence commanded attention in ways Eleanor's never could. At 32, he had inherited not merely wealth, but an empire. Technology companies that spanned continents, real estate investments that reshaped city skylines, and a reputation for ruthless business acumen that made even his competitors wary. His dark hair was always impeccably styled. His steel-grey eyes seemed to calculate the worth of everything they surveyed, and his tall, imposing frame carried itself with the confidence of one who had never known genuine want or uncertainty. Yet beneath the veneer of success lay a man tormented by the very isolation his wealth had created. Damien had built walls around himself as surely as he had built his fortune, trusting no one completely, viewing every relationship through the lens of what others might hope to gain from his riches. He had never married, despite the constant parade of eligible women thrust before him at social gatherings, beautiful, accomplished creatures who smiled too brightly and agreed too readily with his every utterance. On this particular morning, as Eleanor worked in the grand library, carefully dusting the leather-bound volumes that lined the walls from floor to ceiling, she became aware of voices drifting through the partially open door. Mr. Blackwood was entertaining guests in the adjacent drawing room, fellow titans of industry, whose laughter held the sharp edge of men accustomed to making sport of others' misfortunes. "I tell you, Blackwood, it cannot be done," came the voice of Marcus Ashworth, a shipping magnate whose own fortune had been built on the backs of underpaid workers and favorable government contracts. "No woman can resist the allure of wealth for long. They are all the same beneath their protestations of virtue and independence." "Surely you jest," replied another voice, belonging to Theodore Pemberton, whose pharmaceutical empire had made him rich while keeping life-saving medications from those who could not pay his prices. Even the plainest creature, the most humble of circumstances, would leap at the chance to share a millionaire's bed. It is simple human nature. Eleanor's hand stilled upon the spine of a volume of poetry, her breath catching as she recognized the cruel sport these men were making of womankind. She had witnessed such conversations before, though never had she been positioned to overhear such callous dismissal of her entire gender's integrity. Damien's voice, when it came, carried a note of something Eleanor could not quite identify. Perhaps weariness, perhaps challenge. "You speak with such certainty, gentlemen. Yet I wonder if your cynicism stems from the particular circles in which you move. Perhaps not every woman is quite so mercenary." "Come now, Blackwood," Ashworth scoffed. "Your romantic notions do you no credit. Would you care to put your theory to the test?" "What manner of test?" The question came quietly, but Eleanor heard the dangerous undercurrent in her employer's tone. "Choose any woman of modest means and plain appearance," Pemberton suggested, warming to his theme. "Court her as you would any other, but reveal nothing of your true circumstances. Let her believe you are merely a man of middle income. If she accepts your proposal under those conditions, then you shall have proved your point. And if she does not, then you admit that all women are motivated by material considerations, and you donate $100,000 to each of our favorite charities." Ashworth's voice held the satisfied tone of a man certain of his victory. Eleanor pressed closer to the door, her heart racing at the implications of what she was hearing. These men were wagering on the very souls of women, treating the sacred bond of marriage as nothing more than another business transaction to be manipulated for their amusement. The terms seem rather one-sided, Damien observed. What do I gain should your cynicism prove unfounded? The same amount from each of us, Pemberton replied. But more than that, the satisfaction of knowing that true affection still exists in this mercenary world. The silence stretched long enough that Eleanor began to hope Mr. Blackwood would refuse such a degrading proposition. She had observed him from afar during her weeks of employment, noting the moments when his public facade slipped to reveal something more vulnerable beneath. Surely a man who kept volumes of poetry in his personal library, who sometimes paused to watch the sunrise through his office windows, possessed too much honor to engage in such a heartless game. "Very well," came Damien's voice, and Eleanor felt her world shift on its axis. "I accept your wager, but I choose my own candidate." "Excellent!" Ashworth exclaimed. "And who might this paragon of feminine virtue be?" The pause that followed seemed to stretch across eternity. Eleanor found herself holding her breath, as though the very act of breathing might somehow influence the words about to be spoken. "My housemaid, Eleanor Fairfax." The book in Eleanor's hands tumbled to the floor with a sound that seemed to echo through the vast library like thunder. Her face burned with a mixture of humiliation and fury as the implications crashed over her. She was to be nothing more than a test subject in their cruel experiment, a laboratory specimen to prove or disprove their theories about feminine nature. The plain little mouse? Pemberton's laughter was cruel and sharp. "Blackwood, you make this almost too easy. That creature would marry a chimney sweep if he promised her a roof over her head." Eleanor's hands clenched into fists at her sides. The plain little mouse had university education, spoke 3 languages fluently, and had managed the household accounts for her previous employer with more skill than many men in similar positions. But what use were accomplishments when society had already decreed her worthless based solely upon her unremarkable features and empty purse? "We shall see," was all Damien replied, but something in his tone made Eleanor shiver despite the warmth of the morning sun streaming through the library windows. As the guests took their leave, their voices fading down the marble corridors, Eleanor remained frozen beside the towering bookshelves. The volume she had dropped lay open at her feet, its pages displaying a poem by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways." The irony was almost unbearable. She became aware of footsteps approaching the library door and quickly knelt to retrieve the fallen book, hoping to appear busy with her duties. But as the door swung fully open, she found herself looking up into the steel-grey eyes of Damien Blackwood himself. For a long moment, neither spoke. Eleanor remained on her knees, clutching the poetry volume to her chest like a shield, while Damien studied her with an expression she could not read. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, as though he had run his fingers through it, and there was something in his posture that suggested uncertainty, a quality she had never associated with her formidable employer. "Miss Fairfax," he said finally, his voice carrying none of its usual commanding authority, "I wonder if I might speak with you privately." Eleanor rose slowly to her feet, acutely aware of her plain grey dress, her work-roughened hands, the rebellious strand of hair that had escaped her chignon. Next to his impeccable appearance, she felt every inch the plain little mouse his guests had labelled her. "Of course, sir," she replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, "though I should mention that I could not help but overhear portions of your conversation just now." Something flickered across his features, surprise perhaps, or calculation. "I see. And what precisely did you overhear?" Eleanor lifted her chin, drawing upon reserves of dignity she had not known she possessed. "Enough to understand that I am to be the subject of some manner of experiment, a wager, I believe, concerning the mercenary nature of women." Damien moved closer, and Eleanor caught the scent of his cologne. something expensive and masculine that made her pulse quicken despite her anger. His height forced her to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact, placing her at a disadvantage that she suspected was entirely intentional. "You disapprove," he observed, though whether it was a question or a statement remained unclear. "I find it curious," Eleanor replied carefully, "that men who have never known want should judge so harshly those who have. It requires little virtue to remain honorable when one's virtue has never truly been tested." The words hung between them like a challenge. Eleanor immediately regretted her boldness. Servants who spoke so freely to their employers rarely remained employed for long. But something in Damien's expression suggested that her honesty had struck a chord rather than given offense. "You speak as one who has experienced such testing firsthand," he said quietly. Eleanor thought of the governess position she had lost when her employer's son had attempted to force his attentions upon her, of the recommendations that had never materialized, of the nights she had gone hungry rather than accept the sort of protection offered by men who viewed her circumstances as an opportunity. But such confessions were not for the ears of employers, no matter how direct their questions. "I speak as one who has observed the world with clear eyes, sir. Nothing more." Damien began to pace the length of the library, his hands clasped behind his back. Eleanor remained motionless, uncertain whether she was expected to return to her duties or await whatever pronouncement he was preparing to make. "Miss Fairfax," he said at last, turning to face her once more, "I find myself in an unusual position. My friends have made certain assumptions about your character and about the character of women in general that I believe to be unfounded. I should like to prove them wrong." "And how do you propose to do that, sir?" "By offering you something that no woman of mercenary inclinations could refuse: marriage to a man of considerable wealth." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Even knowing what was to come, hearing the words spoken aloud sent shockwaves through her system. "I beg your pardon. You heard correctly. I am prepared to offer you marriage, Miss Fairfax, my hand, my name, and all the social and financial advantages that accompany both." The poetry book in Eleanor's hands seemed to grow heavier, and in return, nothing more than your honest answer. "Will you accept, knowing that marriage to me would elevate you far beyond your current circumstances? Or will you refuse, proving that not every woman can be bought with the promise of wealth and status?" Eleanor stared at him, searching for some sign that this was an elaborate jest. But his expression remained serious, almost grave, as he awaited her response. "You are asking me to marry you," she said slowly, "so that you might win a wager with your friends about whether I am a fortune hunter. That is one way of looking at the matter. What other way is there?" Damien was quiet for so long that Eleanor began to think he would not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice held an odd note of vulnerability. "Perhaps I am tired of being surrounded by people who see only my bank account when they look at me. Perhaps I am curious to know what it might feel like to be wanted for something other than what I can provide." The confession hung between them, like a bridge neither knew how to cross. Eleanor found herself studying his face with new eyes, seeing past the handsome features and expensive clothes to something lonelier than she had imagined possible. "But you would not truly be wanted for yourself," she pointed out gently. "You would be deceiving me about your circumstances. How could any affection I might develop be genuine if it is based upon falsehood?" "That," Damien said, "is exactly what I told myself when my friends proposed this wager. Yet here I stand, making you this offer nonetheless." Eleanor moved to one of the library windows, gazing out at the perfectly manicured grounds that stretched as far as the eye could see. Somewhere beyond those grounds lay the world she had known before coming to Thornfield Manor, a world of constant uncertainty, of choosing between pride and survival, of making herself invisible to avoid unwanted attention. "What would you have me believe about your circumstances?" she asked without turning around. "That I am Damien Black, a middle manager at a technology firm. That I rent a modest apartment in the city and drive a reliable but unremarkable car. that I can offer you a comfortable but not luxurious life." Eleanor almost smiled at the transparent simplicity of the deception. "And your friends? What becomes of them in this fabricated life? Business associates, nothing more." She turned to face him then, noting how the morning light softened his stern features. "You realize, of course, that this entire proposition is fundamentally dishonest." "Yes, and that you are asking me to enter into the most sacred of human bonds under false pretenses." "Yes, and that regardless of how I answer, you will have proven something to your satisfaction. Either that I am as mercenary as they believe, or that I am naive enough to be manipulated by a wealthy man's games." Damien's jaw tightened. "I had not considered the matter in quite those terms." "Then allow me to suggest that you consider it further." Eleanor set the poetry volume carefully on a nearby table and smoothed her skirts. "I must return to my duties now, sir. The silver service requires polishing before luncheon." She had nearly reached the door when his voice stopped her. "Eleanor?" The use of her given name, spoken in that low, compelling voice, sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. She paused, but did not turn around. "I have made you this offer in good faith," he continued. "But I realize now that I have been unfair to you. If you wish to refuse, I will understand completely. Your position here will not be affected by your decision." Eleanor's hand rested on the door handle as she considered her response. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to refuse and pretend this conversation had never taken place. She could continue her work, collect her wages, and perhaps eventually find a position with a family who valued her education and experience. But as she stood there, something stirred within her, a spark of the adventurous spirit that had led her to accept the governor's position in the first place, despite knowing the risks a young woman faced in such circumstances. Perhaps it was pride, or perhaps it was curiosity, but she found herself wanting to see how this strange game would play out. "I will consider your offer," she said, without turning around. "But I require one condition, which is that you court me properly, as you would any woman you genuinely wish to marry. No deception beyond the matter of your finances, no games within games. If I am to make an honest choice, I must be given honest courtship." The silence stretched so long that Eleanor began to think he had left the room. Then quietly came his response. "Agreed." Eleanor nodded once and left the library, her heart pounding with the magnitude of what she had just set in motion. As she made her way toward the kitchens, she passed a hall mirror and caught sight of her reflection. The same plain face, the same simple dress, the same unremarkable figure that had prompted such cruel laughter from Damien's guests. But something in her eyes had changed, something that spoke of courage, or perhaps foolishness. She was not yet certain which. In the library behind her, Damien stood alone among the thousands of volumes, staring at the door through which Eleanor had vanished. He had expected either immediate acceptance or outright refusal, not this measured consideration that suggested depths he had not anticipated. For the first time since agreeing to his friend's wager, he wondered whether he truly understood what he had set in motion, or whether Eleanor Fairfax might prove to be far more than the plain little mouse any of them had imagined. Part 2. 3 days passed before Damien approached Eleanor again, and she had begun to wonder if their extraordinary conversation had been nothing more than a peculiar dream, brought on by too many hours spent dusting the romantic poetry that filled his library. She went about her duties with practiced efficiency, polishing silver until it gleamed like mirrors, arranging flowers from the conservatory in crystal vases, and maintaining the pristine appearance that Thornfield Manor demanded of all who dwelled within its walls. Yet she found herself hyper-aware of every sound in the corridors, every footstep that might herald his approach. When the housekeeper, Mrs. Henley, informed her that she was to take her afternoon meal in the servants' hall rather than the kitchen, Eleanor felt a flutter of anticipation that she could not entirely suppress. The servants' hall at Thornfield Manor was a world unto itself, governed by hierarchies as rigid as any aristocratic court. Mrs. Henley reigned supreme, her grey hair perfectly coiffed beneath a lace cap, her black dress immaculate despite the demands of managing a household staff of nearly 30. Below her, the butler, cook and lady's maid held positions of considerable authority, while the footmen, chambermaids and kitchen staff occupied the lower rungs of this carefully ordered society. Eleanor, as the newest and lowest-ranking member of the household, typically ate her meals in solitude at the far end of the long oak table. But on this particular afternoon, she found herself the object of intense scrutiny from her fellow servants, their conversations dying to whispers as she entered the hall. "Miss Fairfax," Mrs. Henley's voice carried the authority of one accustomed to absolute obedience. "You're to present yourself in the morning room after you've finished your meal. The master wishes to speak with you." A collective intake of breath swept through the assembled staff. In the rigid world below stairs, being summoned by the master was either a harbinger of swift dismissal or, in rarer cases, unexpected advancement. Eleanor nodded calmly, though her pulse quickened with anticipation. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Henley," ventured Mary, one of the chambermaids, "but is Miss Fairfax in some sort of trouble?" The housekeeper's expression remained impassive. "That is not for us to speculate upon. We serve this household by maintaining appropriate boundaries and minding our own duties." But Eleanor caught the curious glances that followed her as she made her way to the table, and she sensed the undercurrent of gossip that would undoubtedly flow through the servants' quarters once she departed. In a house as vast as Thornfield Manor, privacy was a luxury afforded only to those wealthy enough to purchase it. The morning room, when Eleanor entered it precisely at the appointed time, seemed designed to emphasize the vast gulf between employer and servant. Silk wallpaper in shades of cream and gold reflected the afternoon sunlight, while Turkish carpets muffled her footsteps on polished hardwood floors. Damien stood, with his back to her, gazing out at the formal gardens where peacocks strutted among perfectly manicured topiary. He had exchanged his usual impeccably tailored suit for clothing that was well made but decidedly less elegant. Dark trousers, a white shirt open at the collar, and a wool jacket that looked as though it might have been purchased from a respectable but unremarkable shop. The transformation was subtle but effective, creating the impression of a man who earned his living through honest work rather than inherited wealth. "Miss Fairfax," he said without turning around, "thank you for coming." I serve at your pleasure, sir," she replied, though something in her tone suggested the words carried meanings beyond their surface politeness. He turned then, and Eleanor was struck by how the simpler clothing somehow made him appear more approachable, less intimidating than the commanding figure who typically strode through Thornfield's corridors. Yet his eyes retained their piercing intelligence, and she reminded herself that this gentler appearance was as calculated as everything else about this strange courtship. "I have been thinking about our conversation," he said, moving to a chair near the windows and gesturing for her to take the seat opposite. "About the conditions you set forth." Eleanor remained standing. "Have you indeed? Please sit. What I have to say will take some time." She perched on the edge of the indicated chair, her back straight, hands folded in her lap, the posture of a woman prepared for whatever blow might fall. Damien noted with something that might have been admiration. "I realize that I have placed you in an impossible position," he began. "I am asking you to trust a man who has already admitted to deception, to consider marriage to someone whose true nature you cannot possibly know. And yet you persist in asking." "I do." He leaned forward slightly, and Eleanor caught again that scent of expensive cologne that seemed so at odds with his more modest attire. "But I wish to alter the terms of our arrangement." Eleanor's pulse quickened, though she kept her expression carefully neutral. "In what manner?" "I propose that we spend the next month getting to know each other as equals, not master and servant, not millionaire and housemaid, but simply as Damien and Eleanor, two people exploring the possibility of a future together. And my position here will be maintained, of course, But in the evenings, after your duties are complete, I should like to court you properly. Dinners, conversations, perhaps walks in the gardens when the weather permits." Eleanor studied his face, searching for some indication of his true motives. "To what end? So that when I make my proposal, my true proposal, you will be able to make an informed decision, not based on desperation or circumstance, but on genuine feeling." The words hung between them like a promise, or perhaps a threat. Eleanor found herself thinking of the poetry volume she had been dusting when this all began, of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's passionate verses about love that transcended material considerations. How ironic that she should find herself living a situation that the great poetess had explored in elegant verse. "And what of your friends? Your wager?" Something flickered across Damien's features, regret, perhaps, or shame. "They believe the game has already begun. They expect me to pursue you with the single-minded determination of a hunter stalking prey. They do not need to know that my methods have evolved." Eleanor rose from her chair and moved to the window where Damien had been standing. The peacocks had wandered closer to the house, their magnificent plumage catching the afternoon light like jewels. Such beautiful, vain creatures, she thought, bred for display rather than substance. "You ask me to trust you," she said without turning around, "while simultaneously admitting that you are deceiving everyone around us." Yes, his honesty, brutal and unadorned, caught her off guard. She had expected justification, rationalization, some attempt to make his position appear more palatable. "Why?" she asked. "Because I find myself genuinely curious about you, Eleanor Fairfax. Because 3 days ago you spoke to me with more honesty than I have heard from anyone in years. Because when you looked at me, you saw not my fortune or my influence, but a man making a foolish wager about things he did not understand." She turned to face him then, noting how the afternoon light emphasized the strong line of his jaw, the slight lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and weighty decisions. "You think very highly of my powers of perception. I think you see more than you reveal. I think you have survived circumstances that would have broken lesser spirits, and I think you are far more interesting than either of us initially realized." "Mbu," the compliment delivered with such quiet conviction, sent unexpected warmth through Eleanor's chest. She had grown so accustomed to being overlooked, dismissed, relegated to the background of other people's lives, that this focused attention felt almost overwhelming. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. Damien stood and moved to the room's elegant writing desk, withdrawing a small card from one of its drawers. "Tomorrow evening, if you are agreeable, I should like to take you to dinner. Nothing elaborate, a quiet restaurant where we might converse without interruption." Eleanor accepted the card, noting the address of an establishment she did not recognize. "And I am to believe that Damien Black, middle manager, can afford such entertainment on his salary?" A smile played at the corners of his mouth. Damien Black has been saving his money for just such an occasion. Despite herself, Eleanor found her own lips curving upward. How fortuitous for him. "Indeed. Will you accept?" Eleanor studied the card in her hands, aware that her answer would set events in motion that could not easily be undone. Part of her, the sensible part that had learned caution through hard experience, urged her to refuse, to retreat to the safety of her clearly defined role as servant. But another part, the part that had once dreamed of adventure and romance before life, had taught her the price of such dreams, whispered that opportunities like this rarely presented themselves twice. "I will need to arrange for my duties to be covered," she said finally. "Consider it done. Mrs. Henley has already agreed to adjust the schedules." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "How presumptuous of you." "How hopeful," he corrected. As she prepared to leave, Damien's voice stopped her once more. "Eleanor, there is one more thing." She paused at the door, not trusting herself to turn and face him again. Something in his voice had changed, become softer, more uncertain. "When we are together, during these evenings, I should like for you to speak freely. as you did in the library. No deference, no careful words chosen to avoid offense. Simply your honest thoughts and opinions. That could prove dangerous, Eleanor warned. I have rather strong opinions about a number of subjects. I am counting on it. After she had gone, Damien remained in the morning room as shadows lengthened across the silk wallpaper. What had begun as a simple wager was evolving into something far more complex, and he found himself questioning not Eleanor's motives, but his own. He had told himself that he was merely curious about her character, interested in proving his friend's cynical theories wrong. But the truth, which he was only beginning to acknowledge, was more complicated. In Eleanor Fairfax, he had glimpsed something that his wealth and position had never been able to attract: genuine, uncompromising honesty. She had looked at him that day in the library and seen not a conquest to be won or a fortune to be claimed, but a man making a fundamental error in judgment about human nature. She had challenged him, corrected him, treated him as an equal worthy of frank discourse, rather than a superior requiring constant deference. When was the last time anyone had spoken to him so directly? When had anyone last looked past his carefully constructed public persona to address the man beneath? The questions disturbed him more than he cared to admit. Damien Blackwood had built his empire on the principle that every person could be understood through their desires, that every relationship was ultimately transactional. Yet here was a woman who seemed to operate by different rules entirely. That evening, as Eleanor prepared for sleep in her small chamber on the servants' floor, she found herself staring at the card Damien had given her. The restaurant's address was embossed in elegant script, suggesting an establishment that catered to discerning clientele, not the sort of place a middle manager would typically frequent. But then again, perhaps Damien Black was the sort of man who saved his money for special occasions. Perhaps he believed, as she sometimes still dared to hope, that some experiences were worth the sacrifice of lesser comforts. Mary, her roommate among the servants, had been full of questions about Eleanor's summons to the morning room. Word had already spread through the household that Miss Fairfax had been closeted with the master for nearly an hour, an unprecedented occurrence that had set tongues wagging from the kitchens to the butler's pantry. "He wasn't angry then?" Mary had asked, her round face bright with curiosity. "You weren't being dismissed?" "Nothing like that," Eleanor had replied truthfully. "Mr. Blackwood simply had some additional duties to discuss with me." It was not precisely a lie, though it certainly was not the complete truth. But Eleanor had learned long ago that the complete truth was a luxury that servants could rarely afford. Now, alone in the darkness of her small room, she allowed herself to acknowledge the flutter of anticipation that Damien's invitation had awakened. It had been so long since anyone had wanted her company for its own sake, so long since she had dressed for pleasure rather than practicality, so long since she had been the focus of a man's genuine attention. But even as she entertained these hopeful thoughts, Eleanor reminded herself of the fundamental deception that lay at the heart of their arrangement. Whatever courtship might develop between them, it was built upon a foundation of lies. Damien was not the middle-class suitor he would pretend to be, and she was not the naive housemaid his friends believed her. The question that haunted her as sleep finally claimed her was this: when two people began a relationship based on mutual deception, was genuine affection even possible? Or were they simply actors in an elaborate play, performing roles written by circumstance and pride? Tomorrow evening would begin to provide the answer, though Eleanor suspected that the truth, when it finally emerged, would prove far more complicated than either of them currently imagined. In his own chambers, several floors above, Damien lay awake, wrestling with similar questions. He had initiated this charade to prove a point about feminine virtue, but somewhere in the space of a single conversation, the parameters had shifted. Eleanor Fairfax was not the simple, grateful creature he had expected to charm with modest attention and carefully calculated gestures of affection. She was intelligent, perceptive, and possessed of a moral complexity that both intrigued and unsettled him. As he finally drifted toward sleep, Damien found himself wondering whether he was the hunter or the hunted in this strange game he had set in motion. And for the first time in his carefully ordered life, he discovered that he genuinely did not know the answer. Part 3. The restaurant Damien had chosen proved to be a revelation. Intimate without being ostentatious, elegant without being intimidating. La Petite Étoile occupied the ground floor of a converted townhouse, its warm lighting and exposed brick walls creating an atmosphere that invited quiet conversation rather than grand display. Eleanor, who had expected something far more modest given Damien's supposed circumstances, found herself both impressed and suspicious. She had spent the better part of the afternoon preparing for this evening, a luxury she had not indulged in for months. Her wardrobe, limited as it was, contained one dress suitable for dining out, a simple creation in deep blue wool that she had purchased during her brief period of employment with the merchant's family. It was well made but not fashionable, elegant but not expensive, perfectly appropriate for a woman of modest means dining with a middle-class suitor. Yet as she studied her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand, Eleanor found herself wishing for something more sophisticated, more worthy of the man who waited for her in the drawing room below. The thought troubled her. When had she begun to care so much about Damien Blackwood's opinion of her appearance? He was punctual to the minute, appearing at her door dressed in the same carefully chosen attire that marked him as comfortable but not wealthy. Yet Eleanor, who had spent weeks observing the unconscious authority in his bearing, the innate confidence of his movements, could see how poorly the disguise suited him. Everything about Damien Blackwood proclaimed his true status, from the way he held his shoulders to the expectation in his eyes that the world would bend to his will. "You look lovely," he said as she joined him, and something in his voice suggested that the compliment was genuine rather than merely polite. Eleanor felt warmth rise in her cheeks. "Thank you, though I fear my wardrobe lacks the variety that such occasions typically demand." "I find that beauty has little to do with variety of costume," Damien replied, offering her his arm. "True elegance cannot be purchased." The words were prettily spoken, yet Eleanor detected an undercurrent of meaning that made her glance at him sharply. Was he referring to the women of his actual social circle, those who spent fortunes on gowns and jewels, yet somehow lacked the very quality they sought to achieve? Or was this simply the sort of flattery that came naturally to a man accustomed to charming whatever audience he encountered? The drive to La Petite Étoile provided Eleanor with her first glimpse of the conveyance Damien Black, middle manager, supposedly maintained. The automobile was indeed modest, a well-maintained sedan of respectable age, comfortable but unremarkable. Yet Eleanor noticed details that spoke of expensive care: the leather seats that showed no signs of wear, the dashboard that gleamed with recent polishing, the subtle scent of luxury that no amount of cleaning could entirely eliminate from a vehicle that had once been far more expensive than its current appearance suggested. "An interesting choice of restaurant," Eleanor observed, as Damien handed her down from the car. "Rather sophisticated for someone on a middle manager's salary." He smiled, seemingly untroubled by her implied question. "I believe in saving for the things that matter most. Besides, a man should occasionally stretch beyond his usual boundaries, don't you think?" "Indeed, though one wonders what other boundaries might be subject to such flexibility." Their eyes met across the car's roof, and Eleanor saw a flicker of something that might have been respect in his gaze. He had expected her to be impressed by his gesture, perhaps even overwhelmed by this glimpse of a world beyond her current circumstances. Instead, she was studying the scenario with the analytical mind he was only beginning to appreciate. La Petite Étoile's maître d'hôtel greeted them with the sort of practiced warmth that made every guest feel welcome without being obsequious. Yet Eleanor noticed how his eyes lingered on Damien, with a recognition that seemed at odds with their supposed unfamiliarity. When their table proved to be in a particularly desirable corner, offering both privacy and an excellent view of the small garden beyond the windows. She began to suspect that Damien Black's reservations had been made with assistance that extended beyond mere telephone calls. The menu, when presented, confirmed her growing certainty that this evening was costing far more than a middle manager should reasonably spend. The prices, though not excessive by the standards of Damien's actual income, represented a significant portion of what his fictional persona supposedly earned. Perhaps, Eleanor suggested delicately, we might consider some of the more moderately priced selections. I should hate for you to exceed your budget for my sake. Damien's response was immediate and revealing. Please, order whatever appeals to you. I want this evening to be perfect. Yim. The words carried the easy confidence of a man who had never truly worried about money, and Eleanor filed the observation away with all the others that were accumulating like evidence in a case she was slowly building against his carefully constructed persona. Their conversation, once they had ordered, flowed with surprising naturalness. Damien proved to be an engaging companion, well-read and thoughtful, capable of discussing everything from literature to current events, with an intelligence that Eleanor found genuinely stimulating. Yet she remained aware of the careful editing he applied to his remarks, the way he avoided topics that might reveal too much about his actual circumstances. You mentioned working in technology, Eleanor said during a lull in their discussion of a recent political development. What precisely does your position entail? For just a moment, Damien hesitated, a pause so brief that anyone less observant might have missed it entirely. Systems analysis primarily, evaluating efficiency, identifying areas for improvement. Rather dry work, I'm afraid. Yet you speak of it with evident satisfaction. Not everyone is fortunate enough to find fulfillment in their profession. And you? Do you find fulfillment in domestic service? The question was clearly intended to deflect attention from his own circumstances, but Eleanor chose to answer honestly. I find satisfaction in work well done, regardless of its nature. But I confess that my current position was born of necessity rather than ambition. What would you choose if circumstances were different? Eleanor considered the question seriously, struck by how long it had been since anyone had asked about her dreams rather than her duties. I think I should like to teach. There is something deeply satisfying about helping young minds discover their own capabilities, about opening doors they never knew existed. You have experience with teaching. I was a governess for 2 years before. She paused, uncertain how much of her history she was prepared to reveal. Before circumstances changed, Damien finished gently. Yes. Something in her tone must have warned him against further inquiry, for he changed the subject to safer ground. Yet Eleanor caught him studying her with new attention, as though her brief glimpse of vulnerability had revealed something he found unexpectedly compelling. The meal itself was exquisite, course after course of perfectly prepared dishes that spoke of a kitchen staff skilled in the highest culinary arts. Eleanor, who had grown accustomed to the simple fare of the servants' hall, found herself savoring flavors she had nearly forgotten existed. Yet even as she enjoyed the luxury, she remained acutely aware of its cost. This must represent nearly a week's wages for you, she observed, as the waiter presented them with an elaborate dessert that looked more like sculpture than food. Damien's smile held a hint of rueful acknowledgement. Perhaps I am more extravagant than wise, but some experiences are worth the sacrifice, don't you think? Are they? Or do we sometimes convince ourselves that our desires are necessities simply because we lack the discipline to deny them? The question hung between them like a challenge, and Eleanor saw Damien's eyes narrow slightly as he processed both her words and their implications. She was questioning not merely his financial priorities, but his fundamental character, and they both knew it. You have a rather austere philosophy for someone so young, he observed. Necessity teaches harsh lessons. I have learned to distinguish between want and need. And yet you are here, sharing an expensive meal with a man you barely know. Does that suggest want or need? Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks at the directness of his challenge. Perhaps it suggests curiosity. Or perhaps simply the human desire for companionship after months of solitude? Nothing more? The question was quietly asked, but Eleanor heard the weight behind it. He was probing, testing, trying to determine what had motivated her acceptance of his invitation. She found herself studying his face in the candlelight, noting the strong lines of his jaw, the intelligence in his grey eyes, the unconscious authority that informed his every gesture. "What answer would you prefer?" she asked finally. "An honest one." Eleanor laughed softly, though there was little humour in the sound. Honesty. How refreshing to hear that quality valued by someone who has been less than forthcoming about his own circumstances. Damien's hand stilled on his wineglass. "I beg your pardon?" "Come now, Mr. Black. Did you truly believe I would not notice the contradictions? The expensive care lavished on your supposedly modest automobile? The easy familiarity with which the staff here treat you? The casual way you order dishes that cost more than most people spend on food in a month?" For a long moment, Damien said nothing. Around them, the quiet conversations of other diners provided a gentle backdrop to their charged silence. Eleanor watched emotions play across his features, surprise, calculation, and perhaps something that looked like relief. "You are very observant," he said finally. "I am very poor," Eleanor corrected. "Poverty teaches one to notice such details. They can mean the difference between safety and danger, between trust and betrayal." "And which do you believe this is?" Eleanor considered the question seriously, studying the man across from her with new eyes. The careful facade was cracking, revealing glimpses of the complex reality beneath. "I believe," she said slowly, "that you are a man who has forgotten what it means to live authentically. You have become so accustomed to performance that you have lost touch with your true self." The observation struck him like a physical blow. Eleanor saw him flinch, saw the careful composure slip for just an instant to reveal something raw and vulnerable. "That is rather a harsh judgment from someone who knows so little about my circumstances. Is it? Tell me, Mr. Black, or should I say Mr. Blackwood, when did you last have a conversation where you felt you could speak without calculation? When did you last trust someone enough to reveal your genuine thoughts and feelings?" The use of his real name seemed to galvanize him. Damien straightened in his chair, his expression hardening into something more familiar, the mask of authority and control he wore in his business dealings. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting that we abandon this charade and speak honestly with each other. You're not a middle manager. I'm not the naive housemaid your friends believe me to be. And this elaborate courtship is based on a foundation of mutual deception that serves neither of us well." Eleanor reached for her glass of wine, noting how her hand trembled slightly. She had committed herself now, abandoned the safety of pretense for the dangerous territory of truth. "You know who I am," Damien said quietly. "I suspected from the beginning. The way you carry yourself, the unconscious expectation that others will defer to your wishes, the casual references to things no middle manager would know. Yes, I know you are Damien Blackwood of Blackwood Industries. Yet you came here tonight anyway. I came because I was curious about what manner of man would make such a wager about a woman's character. I came because I wanted to understand what drives someone who has everything to seek something so fundamental as genuine human connection through elaborate deception." Damien was quiet for so long that Eleanor began to fear she had overplayed her hand. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she had not heard before. "You want to know what drives me? Loneliness, Miss Fairfax. The peculiar isolation that comes from never being certain whether people value you or your fortune. The exhaustion of constantly wondering whether every smile, every word of affection, every gesture of friendship is genuine or calculated." The admission hung between them like a confession, raw and unguarded in a way that transformed the elegant restaurant into something more intimate than Eleanor had expected. "So you decided to test me," she said softly, "to see if I could pass some arbitrary measure of virtue that would prove your cynical friends wrong." "Initially, yes, But somewhere between the library and this evening, my motivations became more complex. Eleanor studied his face in the flickering candlelight, noting the vulnerability he was struggling to conceal. How complex? Complex enough that I find myself genuinely hoping you will not fail whatever test this has become. Complex enough that the thought of you accepting my proposal merely for financial security has begun to trouble me far more than losing a simple wager. The waiter appeared at their table, discreetly inquiring whether they required anything further. Damien waved him away with the unconscious authority of someone accustomed to command, another small gesture that reinforced Eleanor's certainty about his true identity. "And what of me?" Eleanor asked when they were alone again. "What role am I to play in this drama you have created? Am I to pretend ignorance of your deception? Am I to act surprised when the truth finally emerges? What would you prefer?" Eleanor pushed back her chair and stood, noting how Damien immediately rose as well, the reflexive courtesy of a man raised to certain standards of behavior. "I would prefer honesty, Mr. Blackwood, from both of us. If we are to continue this strange courtship, let it at least be based on truth rather than mutual performance." She moved toward the restaurant's entrance, aware of Damien following close behind. The evening air was cool against her flushed cheeks as they stepped onto the sidewalk, and she took a deep breath of it as though trying to clear her lungs of the elaborate pretense that had surrounded their dinner. "Eleanor," Damien's voice stopped her as she moved toward the car. "I owe you an apology." She turned to face him, noting how the streetlights cast shadows across his features, making him appear younger and somehow more approachable than the commanding figure she had grown accustomed to seeing in Thornfield Manor's corridors. "For the deception? For underestimating you. My friends spoke of you as though you were a simple creature, easily understood and manipulated. I allowed their crude assessment to influence my own judgment, and I was wrong to do so." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest at his words, not forgiveness precisely, but a recognition that his admission required more courage than she had initially credited him with. "And the wager? What becomes of that?" Damien's smile held no humor. "The wager has become irrelevant. Whatever happens between us from this point forward will have nothing to do with proving points about feminine virtue or masculine cynicism." Then what will it have to do with?" He moved closer, near enough that she could catch the scent of his cologne, could see the flecks of silver in his grey eyes. "With discovering whether two people who have every reason to distrust each other might still find something genuine worth pursuing." The words were quietly spoken, but they carried implications that made Eleanor's pulse quicken. This was no longer a game or a test, or an elaborate charade designed to prove a point. This was something more dangerous and far more real. "That could prove a costly discovery," she warned. "The most worthwhile things usually are," Damien replied. "The question is whether you are willing to risk the cost." As they drove back to Thornfield Manor in companionable silence, Eleanor found herself contemplating the evening's revelations. The careful edifice of pretense had crumbled, leaving them both exposed and vulnerable in ways they had not anticipated. Yet rather than feeling cheated or manipulated, Eleanor discovered that she felt oddly liberated. The burden of performance had been lifted, leaving room for something more authentic to develop. Whether that something would prove to be love or merely mutual fascination remained to be seen, but at least it would be real. Damien, for his part, found himself reviewing the evening with a mixture of admiration and trepidation. Eleanor Fairfax had proven herself to be far more formidable than he had imagined, capable of seeing through his deceptions while maintaining her own dignity and composure. She had challenged him, called him to account for his behavior, and somehow managed to do so without destroying the fragile connection that was developing between them. As Thornfield Manor came into view, its windows glowing warmly in the darkness, both understood that they had crossed a threshold from which there could be no retreat. Whatever developed between them now would be built on truth rather than illusion, making it both more precious and infinitely more fragile than either had dared to hope. Part 4. The transformation in their relationship was both subtle and profound. In the days following their dinner at La Petite Étoile, Eleanor found that the elaborate pretense of master and servant had evolved into something more complex. They were no longer performing predetermined roles, but discovering the people they might become when freed from society's rigid expectations. Damien had abandoned his middle manager disguise, though he continued to dress with studied casualness during their evening encounters. These meetings had become a cherished ritual. After Eleanor completed her duties and the household settled into its nighttime routine, she would find him waiting in the conservatory or the library, two figures moving through the grand spaces of Thornfield Manor, like conspirators in some elaborate rebellion against propriety. Their conversations ranged across territories that Eleanor had never expected to explore with someone of Damien's social position. He spoke with surprising candor about the isolation that accompanied great wealth, the difficulty of forming genuine relationships when every interaction carried the suspicion of ulterior motives. She, in turn, found herself revealing aspects of her past that she had guarded carefully, the circumstances that had led to her dismissal from the governor's position, her struggles to maintain dignity while accepting charity, the careful calculations required to survive in a world that offered few protections for women without family or fortune. "You never speak of your family," Damien observed one evening as they walked through the moonlit gardens. The late October air carried the scent of dying leaves and the first hint of winter's approach, and Eleanor had wrapped herself in a shawl that she had inherited from her mother, one of the few beautiful things she still possessed. "There is little to speak of," she replied, though something in her voice suggested depths of pain that she was not yet ready to explore. "My father was a clergyman, my mother the daughter of a minor gentleman. Both died when I was 17. Influenza took them within days of each other." "I'm sorry." The words were quietly spoken, carrying genuine sympathy rather than mere social convention. Eleanor glanced at him, noting how the moonlight softened the stern lines of his face. "You never speak of yours either." Damien's smile held no warmth. "My father was a brilliant businessman and a cold, calculating man who viewed relationships as strategic alliances. My mother was a beautiful woman who married for security and spent her life regretting the choice. They provided me with every advantage money could purchase and no understanding whatsoever of what it meant to be genuinely loved." The confession hung between them like a bridge across the chasm of their different circumstances. Eleanor felt a surge of something that might have been sympathy or perhaps recognition. She had lost her parents to death, but he had lost his to emotional poverty, and perhaps that was equally devastating. "Is that why you made your wager?" she asked. "To prove that authentic feeling still exists somewhere in the world?" Damien stopped walking and turned to face her fully. In the moonlight, his eyes appeared almost silver, and Eleanor felt her breath catch at the intensity of his gaze. "Perhaps initially, but I find that my motivations have evolved considerably since then." "Into what?" Instead of answering directly, Damien reached into his jacket and withdrew a small velvet box that seemed to glow in the pale light. Eleanor's heart lurched as she recognized what it must contain, even as her mind scrambled to process the implications of this moment. "Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying a tremor she had never heard before, "I know that our beginning was unconventional, even unforgivable. I know that you have every reason to doubt my sincerity, given the circumstances that brought us together. But what I feel for you now has nothing to do with wagers or proofs or the opinions of cynical friends." He dropped to one knee on the gravel path, heedless of his expensive clothing, and opened the box to reveal a ring that took Eleanor's breath away. The central diamond caught the moonlight and threw it back in brilliant fractals, surrounded by smaller stones that created a constellation of fire against the dark velvet. "Will you marry me? Not to prove a point about virtue or to settle a foolish bet between men who understand neither women nor love, but because somewhere in these past weeks I have discovered that you are the first person who has ever seen me clearly and chosen to stay." Eleanor stared down at him, her mind reeling with the magnitude of what he was offering. The ring alone was worth more than she would earn in a lifetime of honest work, and the social elevation that marriage to Damien Blackwood would provide was beyond her wildest dreams. Yet those considerations felt strangely distant compared to the vulnerability she saw in his face, the way his hands trembled slightly as he held the box. "Damien," she whispered, then stopped, uncertain what words could possibly encompass the complexity of what she was feeling. "I know it seems sudden," he continued, misinterpreting her silence as hesitation. "I know that you have no reason to trust me given how this all began. But I swear to you, Eleanor, that what I offer now is genuine. I love you, not the idea of you, not the challenge you represent, not the way you make me feel about myself, but you. Your intelligence, your strength, your refusal to be impressed by things that matter little. Your ability to see truth even when it is carefully hidden." The words washed over Eleanor like a benediction, each one seeming to heal wounds she had not realized she carried. No one had ever spoken to her with such reverence, such careful attention to the qualities she valued most in herself. Yet even as her heart soared at his declaration, another part of her mind was conducting rapid calculations. The timing of this proposal, coming so soon after their honest conversation, suggested impulse rather than careful consideration. And hovering always in the background was the specter of his friend's wager, the cruel game that had brought them together in the first place. "What of your friends?" she asked finally. "What of the bet that started all this?" Damien's expression hardened. "They forfeited any claim to influence my decisions when they reduced human feeling to a commercial transaction. Whatever I choose now will be for my own reasons, not theirs. But they will assume that my acceptance proves their point, that I am indeed the fortune hunter they believe me to be. Do you care what they think?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. The opinions of Marcus Ashworth and Theodore Pemberton meant nothing to her personally, but their assumptions would follow her into society, coloring every interaction she had with Damien's social circle. She would be forever marked as the servant who married her employer, the fortune hunter who succeeded in her mercenary goals. "I care what such assumptions might mean for you," she said finally. "Your reputation, your business relationships. Surely marrying someone of my background will create difficulties you have not fully considered." Damien stood, closing the ring box, but keeping it in his hand. "Eleanor, I am worth several $100 million. I have business interests on 3 continents and enough influence to weather whatever social disapproval my marriage might create. What I do not have, and have never had, is someone who looks at me and sees not dollar signs or opportunity, but simply a man worth loving." The stark honesty of his words struck Eleanor like a physical blow. She had spent so much time analyzing his motivations, questioning his sincerity, protecting herself against the possibility of betrayal, that she had not allowed herself to fully acknowledge what was developing between them. "You believe I see you that way?" she asked. "I hope you do, because that is certainly how I have come to see you, not as a means to an end or a solution to a problem, but as the woman I want to spend my life with." Eleanor turned away from him, needing space to think without the distraction of his intense gaze. The garden stretched around them in moonlit beauty, every carefully tended shrub and precisely placed stone, a testament to the ordered world that Damien's wealth had created. Yet here they stood, 2 people whose lives had been thrown into chaos by an encounter neither had anticipated. "I need time to consider," she said finally. Damien's sharp intake of breath told her that this was not the answer he had hoped for, but when she turned back to face him, his expression remained carefully controlled. "Of course, take all the time you need. And if I refuse, what then? Do I return to my position as housemaid? Do we pretend this conversation never occurred?" "Eleanor," he said gently, "regardless of your decision about marriage, your circumstances have already changed. I could not bear to see you return to a life of servitude, not when I know your capabilities, your education, your potential. If you choose not to marry me, I will ensure that you have other opportunities, perhaps a position as a companion to an elderly lady or a teaching post at a respectable school. The offer was generously made, yet Eleanor felt a flicker of something that might have been resentment. Even his kindness carried the weight of his wealth, the assumption that his resources could reshape her life, regardless of her preferences. You would purchase my freedom whether I accept your proposal or not. Something in her tone must have warned him of dangerous ground, for Damien hesitated before responding. I would offer you choices that your current circumstances do not provide. The decision of what to do with such opportunities would be entirely yours. Eleanor studied his face in the moonlight, searching for signs of the calculating businessman who had originally proposed this elaborate charade. But what she saw was simpler and somehow more troubling. A man who had grown accustomed to solving problems with money, who could not conceive of situations that his wealth could not improve. Do you understand, she asked quietly, that your offer places me in an impossible position? If I accept your proposal, I will always wonder whether I was motivated by gratitude rather than love. If I refuse, I will be accepting charity from a man I have rejected, which seems both ungrateful and hypocritical. Damien's expression shifted as he processed the implications of her words. I had not considered. I was trying to remove the element of financial coercion from your decision, not create a different form of pressure. Yet that is precisely what you have done. They stood in silence for several minutes, each lost in contemplation of the complex web that their situation had become. Eleanor found herself thinking of the poetry she had been dusting when this all began, of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's passionate exploration of love that transcended worldly considerations. How ironic that she should find herself living within verses she had so often read, yet feeling so uncertain about the emotions they celebrated. Perhaps, she said finally, the question is not whether I can trust your motivations, but whether I can trust my own. Damien moved closer, careful not to crowd her, but positioning himself where she could see his face clearly. What do you mean? I mean that I have spent these past weeks telling myself that I was participating in this courtship out of curiosity, or pride, or simple human loneliness. But the truth is more complicated than that. She paused, gathering courage for the admission that would leave her completely vulnerable. The truth is that somewhere in the space between our first conversation and this moment, I have come to care for you more deeply than I thought possible. Not for your wealth or your influence or the security you could provide, but for the man you become when you forget to perform, when you speak honestly about your fears and hopes and disappointments. Damien's breath caught audibly. Eleanor. But caring for someone and trusting them are not the same thing, and I find that I cannot give you the answer you seek until I understand one thing completely. Which is? Eleanor lifted her chin, drawing upon reserves of courage she had not known she possessed. I need to know what you discovered on our wedding night that stunned you so completely, because whatever secrets still lie between us will poison whatever future we might build together. Damien went very still, his expression shifting into something Eleanor could not read. I'm afraid I don't understand. Ooh, don't you? The phrasing was quite specific in the story your friends would tell, that what you uncovered on our wedding night stunned you. What revelation were they expecting? What discovery would prove their point about feminine duplicity once and for all? The silence stretched between them like a chasm, and Eleanor saw knowledge dawn in Damien's eyes, the realization that she had understood from the beginning that his friend's wager involved more than simple courtship and proposal. They expected you to discover something that would validate their cynical view of women, she continued relentlessly. Something that would prove I was not the virtuous creature you believed me to be. What was it, Damien? What secret were they so certain I was hiding? When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. They believed that no truly virtuous woman would accept a proposal from a man she believed to be of modest means. They expected that when the truth of my identity was revealed, you would confess to having known all along that your apparent indifference to wealth was nothing more than an elaborate performance designed to ensnare a wealthy husband. Eleanor felt the words hit her like physical blows. They wagered that I was a fortune hunter, skilled enough to play at being disinterested in fortune. Yes, and you? What did you wager? Damien's hands clenched at his sides. I wagered that you would be genuinely surprised by the revelation of my wealth, that your feelings for me were authentic rather than calculated. Eleanor laughed, though the sound held no humor. How neatly you have arranged things. If I had remained ignorant of your true identity until our wedding night, my surprise would have proved your point. But since I discovered the truth beforehand and chose to continue our courtship anyway, what does that prove? It proves that I was wrong to make such a wager in the first place. It proves that human feelings cannot be reduced to simple transactions or predictable responses to stimuli. Does it? Or does it simply prove that I am a more skilled actress than your friends anticipated? The question hung between them like an accusation, and Eleanor saw Damien flinch as though she had struck him. You cannot believe that, he said. Can't I? After all, what better way to secure a wealthy husband than to appear completely disinterested in his wealth? What more effective strategy than to seem to see through his deceptions while secretly encouraging them? Eleanor was pushing him deliberately now, testing the foundations of whatever trust had developed between them. If their relationship could not survive complete honesty about the suspicions that still lingered between them, then it was not worthy of the commitment he was asking her to make. If that were true, Damien said slowly, then you would have accepted my proposal immediately rather than asking for time to consider. Would I? Or am I simply skilled enough to know that appearing reluctant will make my eventual acceptance seem more genuine? Damien stared at her for a long moment, his expression cycling through confusion, hurt, and finally something that looked like understanding. You are testing me, he said. Yes, to see if my feelings for you can survive the same sort of cynical scrutiny that your friends applied to yours. Yes, and if I fail this test, if I allow their poisonous suspicions to contaminate what we have built together. Eleanor smiled, and for the first time in their entire conversation, the expression held genuine warmth. Then you will have proven yourself unworthy of the trust you are asking me to place in you. Because love that cannot survive doubt, Damien, was never love at all. It was simply another form of transaction disguised in prettier language. As understanding dawned fully in his eyes, Damien felt something shift fundamentally in his perception of the woman standing before him. Eleanor Fairfax was not simply intelligent or strong or refreshingly honest. She was wise in ways that his wealth and education had never taught him to be. What would convince you of my sincerity? He asked. Time, Eleanor replied simply. Not the heated passion of a few weeks' acquaintance, but the steady affection that grows from truly knowing another person. Courtship without the pressure of wagers or timelines, or the need to prove points to cynical friends. How much time? Eleanor smiled again, and this time Damien caught a glimpse of something that might have been genuine affection in her expression. Ask me again in the spring, Damien, when the garden has gone through its full cycle of death and renewal. When we have weathered whatever storms winter might bring, when we have had sufficient opportunity to discover whether what we feel for each other can survive the ordinary trials that test all human relationships. As they walked back toward Thornfield Manor, the ring box safely returned to Damien's pocket. Both understood that they had crossed another threshold in their strange courtship. The elaborate games and carefully constructed tests had given way to something more honest and infinitely more fragile. The simple human endeavor of two people learning whether they could build a life together based on trust rather than transaction. Whether they would succeed remained to be seen, but at least now they were attempting something real. Part 5. Conclusion. Winter descended upon Thornfield Manor with unusual severity, blanketing the estate in snow that transformed the familiar landscape into something ethereal and strange. Eleanor found that the season suited her mood. There was something cleansing about the way winter stripped everything to its essence, revealing the true structure of things that summer's abundance had concealed. Her relationship with Damien had evolved during these months of waiting into something she had never experienced before, a courtship based on genuine companionship rather than the urgent passion or calculated strategy that seemed to drive most romantic attachments. They spent their evenings in conversation that ranged across every conceivable subject, from philosophy to literature, to the practical challenges of managing a business empire that touched lives across the globe. Damien had made good on his promise to free her from the constraints of domestic service, creating a position for her that was neither servant nor guest, but something uniquely suited to her talents. She served as his private secretary for matters requiring discretion and intelligence. Managing correspondence with a network of charitable organizations, he supported quietly without the public fanfare that usually accompanied philanthropic endeavors by men of his stature. The work suited her perfectly, engaging her mind while allowing her to remain at Thornfield Manor during their strange period of extended courtship. More importantly, it placed her in a position to observe Damien in his professional capacity, to see how he treated employees, managed difficult decisions, and wielded the considerable power that his wealth provided. What she discovered both impressed and occasionally troubled her. Damien was a fair employer who paid wages above industry standards and maintained working conditions that many of his competitors would have considered unnecessarily generous. Yet he was also capable of ruthless efficiency when business required it, able to make decisions that affected hundreds of jobs with the same cool calculation he applied to investment strategies. "Does it not disturb you?" Eleanor asked one evening as they reviewed termination notices he had approved for a failing division, to reduce human lives to numbers on a balance sheet. Damien looked up from the documents spread across his desk, noting the genuine concern in her expression. Would it be kinder to maintain employment that the company cannot sustain, only to have the entire enterprise collapse and cost thousands of additional jobs? Perhaps not kinder, but more human. Business conducted on purely human considerations rarely remains viable long enough to serve anyone's interests. Sometimes mercy must be subordinated to mathematics. Eleanor studied his face, noting the way his features hardened when he spoke of such matters. The transformation from the man who quoted poetry during their private conversations into the calculating businessman who commanded a corporate empire. "And you feel no conflict between these different aspects of your nature?" "I feel the conflict constantly," Damien admitted. "But I learned long ago that sentiment and business make poor partners. The moment I allow personal feelings to override practical judgment, I become unfit to manage resources that affect so many lives." It was conversations like these that convinced Eleanor of Damien's fundamental sincerity. A man intent on deception would never have revealed the cold pragmatism that sometimes governed his decisions, would never have allowed her to see the moral compromises that his position required. Yet she also began to understand why his previous relationships had failed to satisfy him. The women of his social circle, however beautiful or accomplished, had been content to enjoy the privileges of his wealth without examining the moral complexity of how such wealth was created and maintained. Eleanor, with her governess's education and her intimate knowledge of financial necessity, could engage with these contradictions in ways that both challenged and comforted him. As winter deepened, their relationship acquired an intimacy that Eleanor had never expected possible between two people who had not yet committed to marriage. They shared not just conversations but silences, not just intellectual communion, but an awareness of each other's presence that made separation, even for a few hours, feel like a form of deprivation. It was during one of the season's worst storms, when snow had made travel impossible and the house felt like an island isolated from the rest of the world, that Eleanor finally understood the depth of what had developed between them. She had been working late in Damien's study, cataloguing donations to a scholarship fund they had established for young women seeking education beyond their family's means, when she became aware that he was watching her with unusual intensity. "Is something wrong?" she asked, looking up from the ledger where she had been recording names and amounts. "No," Damien replied, but his voice carried an odd note that made her set down her pen and give him her full attention. He rose from his chair and moved to the window, where snow continued to fall in thick curtains that obscured everything beyond the immediate grounds. "I was thinking about the night I first proposed to you, about the things you said regarding trust and time, and the need to know each other completely before making such a commitment." Eleanor felt her heart begin to beat more rapidly, though she could not have said whether from anticipation or apprehension. And I find myself wondering whether 6 months of winter courtship has provided the knowledge you felt was necessary. The question hung between them like a challenge, and Eleanor found herself reviewing the months they had spent together, not just the conversations and shared work, but the small moments of connection that had accumulated like interest in a carefully tended account. The way he had noticed when she was troubled by correspondence from former colleagues who had fallen on hard times and had quietly arranged assistance without waiting to be asked. The evening he had spent reading aloud to her when she was confined to bed with a winter fever, his voice weaving through her feverish dreams like an anchor to consciousness. The morning she had found him in the conservatory at dawn, staring at a particular orchid with an expression of such profound loneliness that she had understood, perhaps for the first time, the true isolation that his wealth had imposed upon him. "I believe," she said carefully, "that I have learned enough to make an informed decision. But the question is not merely what I have learned about you, Damien. It is what you have learned about yourself during these months." He turned from the window to face her, and Eleanor saw something in his expression that had not been there during his first proposal, a certainty that went deeper than passion or longing. "I have learned that I am capable of happiness in ways I never imagined possible. I have learned that wealth means nothing if it cannot be shared with someone who values the same things I do. And I have learned that love is not the desperate, consuming emotion I once believed it to be, but something steadier and more precious, the daily choice to place another person's well-being alongside your own." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, though she could not have said whether they were born of joy or relief or simple recognition of truth spoken without artifice. "And what of your friends?" she asked. "What of the wager that brought us together?" Damien's smile held a satisfaction she had never seen before. Marcus Ashworth filed for bankruptcy last month. His shipping empire collapsed when his government contracts were cancelled following an investigation into his labor practices. Theodore Pemberton is facing federal charges for price manipulation that kept essential medications from those who needed them most. Eleanor stared at him in shock. What happened? Justice, I suppose. Though I confess that I may have played a small role in ensuring that certain information reached the appropriate regulatory authorities. The admission should have troubled her, but Eleanor found herself feeling only a grim satisfaction. Men who wagered on women's virtue as though it were a commodity to be traded deserved whatever consequences their actions had earned. So the wager has become moot. The wager became moot the night you challenged me to examine my own motivations as rigorously as I was examining yours. What exists between us now has nothing to do with their cynical theories about human nature. Damien moved closer, and Eleanor caught the familiar scent of his cologne, noticed the way the lamplight emphasized the silver threading through his dark hair. When had those silver strands appeared? When had the stern lines around his eyes softened into something more approachable? "Eleanor," he said, and something in the way he spoke her name made her breath catch. "I find myself in the peculiar position of wanting to ask you the same question I asked 6 months ago, but for entirely different reasons." She waited, her heart pounding with an anticipation that had nothing to do with the material advantages his proposal would provide, and everything to do with the man she had come to know during their long winter courtship. "Will you marry me? Not to settle wagers or prove points about virtue or vice, but because I have discovered that you are the other half of a conversation I want to continue for the rest of my life." The proposal was simpler than his first attempt, yet infinitely more precious for its lack of artifice. Eleanor looked into his face and saw not the calculating businessman or the wealthy philanthropist, but simply Damien, a man who had learned to trust her enough to reveal his true self without the protective masks that his position usually required. "Yes," she said, and the words seemed to transform the very air around them. "Yes, I will marry you, because I have discovered that love is not about finding someone who completes you, but about finding someone who challenges you to become the person you were meant to be." When Damien kissed her, it was with the reverence of a man who had finally understood the difference between desire and devotion, between wanting someone and choosing them with full knowledge of the cost such choosing might exact. The ring he placed on her finger was different from the elaborate diamond he had offered months earlier, a simple band of platinum set with a single stone that caught the lamplight like captured starfire. It was elegant without being ostentatious, valuable without being vulgar, perfectly suited to a woman who had learned to appreciate substance over spectacle. "When?" Eleanor asked as they stood together beside the window, watching snow continue to fall across the grounds where they had walked through so many conversations. "Spring," Damien replied, "when the gardens bloom again and we can have a wedding that celebrates life rather than mere acquisition. When we can invite guests who care about our happiness rather than our strategic value to each other." Eleanor smiled, thinking of the small church where her parents lay buried, of the handful of friends who had remained loyal despite her reduced circumstances, of the simple ceremony that would mark the beginning of a marriage built on trust rather than transaction. "There is one condition," she said, and felt Damien tense beside her, "which is that we establish a foundation in your parents' names, something that provides education and support for young women who find themselves without resources or protection. Let their legacy be not the emotional poverty they created, but the opportunities their son chooses to provide others." Damien's arms tightened around her, and Eleanor felt his breath catch with something that might have been relief or gratitude or simple recognition of the grace that forgiveness could provide. "There is something I must tell you," he said after a moment, "something I discovered about you during our months of courtship that my friends would have considered the ultimate validation of their cynical theories." Eleanor pulled back to look at him, noting the serious expression that had replaced his earlier joy. "What is it?" "You are not Eleanor Fairfax, governess fallen on hard times. You are Eleanor Fairfax, daughter of the late Lord Pembroke of Westshire. Your family lost everything in a series of bad investments, but your bloodline is considerably more distinguished than you have allowed anyone to believe." Eleanor stared at him in shock, her mind scrambling to process this revelation. "How did you discover this?" "Private investigators. I had them research your background when I began to consider proposing, not because I doubted your character, but because I wanted to ensure that marriage to me would not somehow endanger you through connections I was unaware of." The admission hung between them like another test, and Eleanor felt the familiar pattern of challenge and response that had characterized their entire courtship. "And what did you make of this discovery?" she asked finally. "I made nothing of it. Your worth has never depended on your ancestry, Eleanor, any more than mine depends on the fortune I inherited. We are valuable because of who we have chosen to become, not because of accidents of birth or circumstance." Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, the final dissolving of barriers she had not even realized she was maintaining. Damien had discovered her secret and found it irrelevant, just as she had discovered his wealth and chosen to see past it to the man beneath. "My friends would have said that your noble blood explains your natural dignity. Your innate understanding of proper behavior, he continued. They would have claimed that breeding tells, that aristocracy cannot be truly hidden, regardless of circumstances. And you, I say that dignity comes from character, not bloodlines. That the grace I see in you was earned through hardship, not inherited through genetics. That the woman I fell in love with was shaped by adversity into someone far more admirable than privilege alone could ever create. As spring arrived at Thornfield Manor, transforming the grounds into a symphony of color and life, Eleanor and Damien were married in a ceremony that perfectly reflected their unconventional courtship. The guest list was small but carefully chosen. People who had supported them through various trials, who understood that the union they were witnessing represented something deeper than social advancement or financial merger. Eleanor wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her slender frame, with the simple platinum ring Damien had chosen catching the sunlight that streamed through the church's ancient windows. Damien, dressed in a perfectly tailored morning coat that somehow managed to suggest success without ostentation, spoke his vows with the same careful honesty that had characterized their entire relationship. But it was the words Eleanor spoke that would be remembered by those present, a commitment that transcended the traditional promises of obedience and devotion to embrace something more complex and precious. I promise to see you clearly, Damien, in success and failure, in strength and vulnerability. I promise to challenge you when you need challenging, to support you when you need support, and to love you not for what you can provide, but for who you are when everything else is stripped away. Later, as they danced at their reception in Thornfield Manor's ballroom, transformed for the occasion into something magical with flowers from their own gardens and candlelight that made everything seem to glow with inner radiance, Eleanor reflected on the strange journey that had brought them together. "Do you ever wonder," she asked as Damien led her through the steps of a waltz that felt like floating, "what would have happened if your friends had never made their wager?" "Every day," Damien replied. "I suspect we would have continued in our separate orbits indefinitely. You invisible in your service, me isolated in my wealth, two people who might have been perfect for each other, never realizing what we were missing. So perhaps we owe them some gratitude, despite their cruel intentions. Perhaps, though I prefer to think that love would have found a way eventually. Truth has a way of revealing itself, Eleanor, regardless of the obstacles we place in its path." As the evening wore on and their guests gradually departed, Eleanor and Damien found themselves alone in the conservatory, where they had spent so many hours in conversation during their long courtship. The space was filled with the scent of blooming jasmine and the sound of water from the small fountain that had provided a soundtrack to so many of their discussions. "Are you happy?" Damien asked, as they stood together among the exotic plants that thrived in this carefully controlled environment. Eleanor considered the question seriously, thinking of all the paths her life might have taken, all the different ways this story might have ended. She thought of the plain little mouse his friends had dismissed so contemptuously, of the desperate housemaid who might have married anyone who offered security, of the noble's daughter who had lost everything and rebuilt her life on determination and dignity. "I am complete," she said finally, "not because marriage has fulfilled some lack in my nature, but because I have found someone who sees all the different aspects of who I am and values each of them." Would be when Damien kissed her this time. It was with the confidence of a man who had finally learned the difference between possession and partnership, between wanting someone and choosing to build a life with them. Outside, the gardens of Thornfield Manor bloomed in magnificent profusion, a testament to the beauty that could grow from careful tending, patient waiting, and the kind of love that valued substance over spectacle, depth over display. The millionaire's wager had been won, though not in any way that Marcus Ashworth or Theodore Pemberton could have anticipated. Eleanor had indeed married for money, but not in the mercenary way they had predicted. She had married for the wealth of spirit she had discovered in a man who had learned to value truth above convenience, love above transaction, and the daily choice of commitment above the easy passion of temporary desire. And what Damien had discovered on their wedding night was not duplicity or calculation, but simply the recognition that Eleanor Fairfax, whether servant or noble, poor or privileged, was exactly who she had always appeared to be, a woman of integrity who had chosen to love him not despite his flaws, but because she had seen past his wealth to discover someone worthy of her devotion. It was, Eleanor reflected as she fell asleep in her husband's arms on their wedding night, the most perfect surprise of all.